Virtually all of the world's ancient scriptures, myths, and sacred stories can be shown to be based on celestial metaphor. They are not intended to be understood literally. They teach profound truths, but if they are taken literally, a literalistic interpretation will actually invert the message that the ancient myths and scriptures are trying to convey. This is an extremely important subject. This is a big topic because there are still people who will claim that unless you take the scriptures, especially they're usually talking about the scriptures of the Old and New Testament, the so-called Old and New Testament scriptures, unless you take them literally, unless you understand them literally, then you are going to miss their meaning, or you are going to change their meaning in a bad way. And I'm going to argue that if you try to understand them literally, you will actually invert their meaning. Literalistic interpretation inverts the meaning of the ancient scriptures, not just of the Bible. There are other scriptures from other cultures. Virtually all the ancient scriptures and myths and sacred stories from cultures around the globe can be shown to be based on the same system of celestial metaphor. Now, how can I assert that taking the scriptures literally inverts their message? How can I say what their message is? How can I say that, my interpretation shows that if you take it literally, you've inverted the message? Well, I'm going to actually go to the scriptures themselves and demonstrate that. One way that we can demonstrate, and I'm going to use the Bible, but like I said, the same argument applies to, I believe, all the world's ancient myths, scriptures, and sacred stories are teaching profound truths, and they're doing that through beautiful celestial metaphors. And that includes all the stories from the start of the Old Testament to the end of the Old Testament, from the start of the so-called New Testament to the end of the so-called New Testament. All those stories are based on celestial metaphor, and they share a common system with other sacred scriptures and sacred stories and myths, ancient myths from around the world. And one way that we can see that the stories in the New Testament or the Old Testament are not based on literal terrestrial history. I've talked in other videos about, for instance, the story of the three magi that visit in the gospel, the nativity scene, and I've shown that those texts don't work if you try and take them literally and terrestrially. The three wise men come from the east. The texts themselves say they came from the east, they followed a star which they saw in the east, and they supposedly ended up in the west. You can't start in the east, follow a star that you see in the east, and get to the west unless you circumnavigate the entire globe. It just doesn't work as literal terrestrial history. Interpreting those texts literally and terrestrially doesn't make sense. It does make sense, it makes perfect sense if you understand that it's speaking in celestial metaphor. That does work for stars that cross the sky, starting in the east and moving to the west and then seeing a star in the east, as I demonstrate in other videos. But today I'd like to actually go to a different way of showing that literalistic interpretation inverts the scriptural meaning. And I'd like to look at the tremendous emphasis that's placed throughout the Bible, throughout the scriptures of the Old and New Testament, also throughout other sacred scriptures from around the world, on the concept of blessing and cursing. If you do a search with the modern tools that we have available, it's very easy to search through the scriptures. You can search for the word bless or blessing, and you'll find literally hundreds of verses that talk about blessing versus cursing. You should bless, you should not curse. I'll just choose a couple representative examples to show that the scriptures of the Bible are all about blessing and not cursing. For instance, in Proverbs chapter 30, in verse 11, we read, talking about a generation, this is a negative characteristic of a certain generation that's being discussed in Proverbs 30, verse 11, that there is a generation that curseth their father and doth not bless their mother. That's a bad thing. In Proverbs 30:11, you shouldn't curse your father and fail to bless your mother, is being implied in that text. Or in the New Testament texts, for instance in Matthew chapter 5 and verses 44 and 45, these are the words attributed to the figure of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. In fact, in Matthew 5 verse 44 we read, "But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you." Bless them that curse you. So blessing is being commanded here. That ye, and it goes on, the text goes on to say, "That ye may be the children of your Father which is in heaven. For he maketh his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sendeth rain on the just and on the unjust." So blessing is being like the Almighty. Blessing is being like the divine who blesses all creation. In Romans chapter 12 and verse 14 we read, "Bless them which persecute you, bless and curse not." Bless and curse not in the text of Romans. And in James, these are just a few representative texts. I'll finish with James chapter 3 verses 9 and 10, another fairly famous passage where James says, "Therewith," talking about our tongue, "therewith," with our tongue, "therewith bless we God, even the Father, and therewith curse we men, which are made after the similitude of God. Out of the same mouth proceedeth blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not so to be." So he's saying, if we use our tongue to bless the divine, and then to curse men and women who are made in the image of the divine, and out of the same mouth we have blessing and cursing, we're a contradiction. These things should not be. We should be blessing and cursing not. That's throughout the scriptures of the Bible we see that, and we see that in other cultures as well. For instance, in the texts of the sacred texts of ancient India, in the Sanskrit texts, in the Mahabharata, for instance, which is a Sanskrit epic, whenever the divinities show up, whenever any of the gods or goddesses appears, we see the text actually says that the mortals who are present place their palms together. This is called the Anjali Mudra. It's commonly understood as a symbol of blessing, but it's also a hand gesture of recognition of the divine. So when you greet someone with palms together, you are recognizing, just as we read in the texts of the Bible, the same concept that mortal men and women carry a divine imprint, a divine spark within them. And this symbol of placing the palms together is a symbol of blessing, and it's still used today in cultures that are descended from that tradition to recognize the value and to respect another person and to say, I recognize the divine spark in you. So we can see the importance of blessing and not cursing. So I want to dig a little bit more into what does it mean? What does actually blessing mean? And as I was just explaining from that example from the Sanskrit epics, where they always put the hands together when a divine power is present, the blessing means recognizing the divine spark in someone else, recognizing that someone else is more than just their physical nature. It's recognizing the spiritual side, not just their physical side, their divine side. But cursing is always the opposite. It's debasing, degrading, belittling, trying to say that someone is not anything more than the sum of their physical bodily makeup. And if you think of curse words or swear words that you're familiar with, we can think of curse words and cursing. When we start swearing at someone, we are using terms that are attempting to force them down just into their body, just to say, all you are is a body. If you think about swear words in English that start with the letter S, they have to do with a bodily function, or the letter F, right? These are swear words in our language. I guess they come from Anglo-Saxon. Somebody will say, oh, I'm using Anglo-Saxon terms here. They're usually Anglo-Saxon terms are short and blunt, or sometimes they are. And when we're talking about these swear words, we're trying to reduce someone down to just their body. We're saying, oh, you're just a letter A. That is reducing someone down to, obviously I'm not saying the whole word here, but you can fill it in your mind. Cursing is reducing someone to their body and denying the divine spark that is within them, saying they're not, that's not present. It's taking them down to an animal, or they're just like a human animal body, whereas blessing is recognizing the spirit and uplifting and trying to elevate the spirit, to enlighten, to inspire, whereas cursing is always trying to debase. Or if there's plenty of curse words that have to do with somebody's sex. In other words, there are curse words to try and put women down, to just say, oh, you're nothing more than that aspect of your physical nature. There's plenty of curse or derogatory words for women. There's derogatory words for members of other ethnicities. They're basically, what we're doing is reducing someone to their physical nature. We're saying nothing more than that, denying the divine spark. Okay? So with that in mind, we can now go into the scriptures, a couple of specific scriptures that I'm going to look at to demonstrate that when we take them literally, they actually end up over here in cursing, when their metaphorical sense has to do with blessing and not reducing people to the physical externalities. So I'd like to start with the story of Shem, Ham, and Japheth in the Hebrew Scriptures, the so-called Old Testament. I've addressed this in many blog posts and some previous videos, and in my book, Star Myths of the World, Volume 3. This is Star Myths of the Bible. But it's found in Genesis chapter 9 and verses 18 through 29. I'd just like to read the text here. This is from the Geneva translation of the 1500s, but you can see it in any different translation that you want. Genesis 9, verse 18. Now the sons of Noah, it's talking about the three sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Beginning in verse 18. Now the sons of Noah going forth of the ark were Shem and Ham and Japheth. And Ham is the father of Canaan. These are the three sons of Noah, and of them was the whole earth overspread. Noah began to be an husbandman, and planted a vineyard. And he drank of the wine, and was drunken, and was uncovered in the midst of his tent. And when Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father, he told his two brethren without. He's going to make fun of his father's embarrassed condition. He has drunk too much wine, and this will happen to any human body if you put enough of the toxic alcohol into your body. You've probably been in this condition yourself, at least I have, where you've imbibed too much wine and your body takes over and you pass out and you fall over. So Noah had drunk from too much wine and passed out. He passed out drunk, and apparently passed out drunk and naked. And when Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father, he told his two brethren without. And verse 23, Then took Shem and Japheth a garment, and put it upon both their shoulders, and went backward, and covered the nakedness of their father with their faces backward, so they saw not their father's nakedness. So they're saying, wait a minute, Ham, let's not just make fun of his embarrassed condition. This will happen to any human body or animal if you give them too much wine. But we recognize that he has dignity. He has the mark of the Creator who made him. We have to see him as something more than the sum of his physical parts. Let's cover him up with respect and let him sleep it off. And they're going to walk backwards with a sheet between their shoulders so they can't see their father's nakedness. Then Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his younger son had done unto him, and said, Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren. He said, Moreover, Blessed be the Lord God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. God persuade Japheth that he may dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. And Noah lived after the flood 350 years. So all the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. Now I've shown that this passage is very clearly based upon celestial metaphor. I'm going to show that right now using some planetarium software, Stellarium, and show that Noah, when he is passed out, he's the constellation that Noah is associated with is what constellation is pouring out water or pouring out wine. It's Aquarius, and Aquarius has this distinctive forward leg, which in some myths, including this one, this story from the Hebrew scripture, is seen as a portion of the male anatomy that you can see if someone is naked, and Ham is looking directly at that and making fun of his father's nakedness. And Ham corresponds to the constellation Capricorn. And we can get into other aspects of the text that show that, but you can see even in these paintings and artistic depictions from centuries later that Ham is very often depicted with characteristics, specific characteristics of the constellation Capricorn. Specifically, his hand gesture will have the two horns of Capricorn, and his other hand will be up to represent the bobtail of this constellation of Capricorn. And you can see this in other artwork in the New Testament as well, when a Renaissance painter will be depicting one of the 12 disciples who corresponds with Capricorn. They'll have the same sort of hand gestures, or these, it's a mudra basically. And also the constellation Capricorn has a deep V shape in it, and you'll usually see either in the arm of that, it actually has two V's, one V for the head of Capricorn and one V for the legs of Capricorn. And you can see that in the sky, you can see that in Renaissance paintings, or in these paintings which come from the 1100s, 1200s, and 1300s, so they're even older, showing that Ham relates to the constellation Capricorn. But there are two constellations, or there's a constellation that walks backward with a sheet in between, just like the two brothers, Shem and Japheth, who don't make fun of their father's nakedness. They don't curse their father. They don't reduce him to just his physical condition at that particular time. They walk backwards and cover him with a sheet, and the sheet is the Great Square of Pegasus. The Great Square of Pegasus, which you can see in the Stellarium Planetarium app, is between two other branches of the constellation, the zodiac constellation of Pisces. And you can actually see that Aquarius is facing towards the Great Square. So the two brothers, they would have to be walking backwards, or as the stars actually wheel through the sky from east to west, Aquarius looks like it's moving backwards because the constellation is actually facing towards the east. So Aquarius moves across the sky backwards. So you can see that Shem and Japheth are walking backwards to cover their father with that sheet that's suspended between their shoulders. And that's the celestial metaphor. So nobody is literally descended from Shem, Ham, or Japheth. These are celestial figures. These are constellations. These are stars that are actually arranged in three-dimensional space. There's a lot of depth in between these different stars. There's nobody who comes from the specific constellation of Capricorn. So the way this has been interpreted or applied by people who take this story literally throughout history, and this is not contested, you can look this up and see plenty of passages which talk about people who are descended from Shem or Ham or Japheth. The way this has been applied by those who take this story literally is to say that some people are descended from Ham, and you heard in the passage that Ham was cursed by his father, and his children from the line of Canaan, the son of Ham, were going to be servants to the children of the other two brothers, Shem and Japheth. And they're going to be blessed. And so this has been applied in a racist way to say, oh, these races are descended from Ham, and these races are descended from Japheth, and these races are descended from Shem, and therefore they're going to be in this relationship to one another where these races are going to serve these races. And you can see that being used as an excuse for a false justification, a false excuse for oppressing, exploiting, taking the lands of others. When you use the scriptures to take away the land of another people, you're saying that those people don't matter. They're not as worthy as the people who are taking their land away. So that is a form of cursing. It's like saying usually it's because of their ethnicity, well, they are worth less. That's a form of inverting the actual message of the story. The actual message of the story is that we should not see people as just the sum of their physical form. That's what Ham was doing. The actual message of the story is that we should not just reduce people to their physical form, their physical nature. That's what Ham was doing, and Shem and Japheth were saying, no, we have to respect others regardless of their bodily condition at this time. They're all made in the image of God, as it says in other passages that we read from the scriptures. So the scriptures are teaching blessing and not cursing, and I would argue that this story is teaching the same thing. And we are all acting like Ham when we're cursing. We're all acting like Ham when we fall into that trap. And we're not supposed to. We're supposed to be acting like Shem and Japheth in the story, who recognize the dignity of, in this case, their father, but not pointing to the physical features, which is what we see Ham doing in the story. So we don't want to act like Ham. We do want to act like Shem and Japheth, and that's what the story is talking about. Be a descendant of Shem and Japheth in that sense. Everybody can think of times when we've probably acted like Ham, and hopefully we can think of times when we didn't act like Ham. But that's what the story is about. But the literal interpretation is actually standing it on its head. It's saying, oh, everybody from this physical, genetic, ethnic makeup is cursed, and everybody from this physical, ethnic, genetic makeup is blessed. That's actually the opposite of what the story is telling you to do. You're not supposed to be reducing people down to the body as if they have nothing more to them than just their physical nature. And that's exactly the way the story has been interpreted or misinterpreted and misapplied. So literalistic interpretation inverts the message. Another example that we can talk about that, interestingly enough, uses that same constellation of Capricorn is the story of Doubting Thomas. Doubting Thomas, or the incredulity of Thomas, it's sometimes called. It's found in the Gospel of John, and in the 20th chapter of the Gospel according to John, we read, beginning in verse 24, that Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, has returned and shown himself to many of the disciples, but not to Thomas. Thomas wasn't there at any of the times, so when they all told Thomas about it, he doubted. He was incredulous. He said, I won't believe it unless I see, and in fact, unless I feel the wounds in his hands and in his side. So, beginning in verse 24 of John 20, we read, But Thomas, one of the 12, called Didymus, was not with them when Jesus came. The other disciples therefore said unto him, We have seen the Lord. But he said unto them, Except I see in his hands the print of the nails, and put mine hand into his side, I will not believe it. And 8 days after, again his disciples were within, and Thomas with them. Then came Jesus, when the doors were shut, and stood in the midst, and said, Peace unto you. After said he to Thomas, Put thy finger here, and see mine hands, and put forth thine hand, and put it into my side, and be not faithless, but faithful. Then Thomas answered, and said unto him, My Lord and my God. John 20, verses 24 through 28. So the way that's literally interpreted is as saying that unless you believe in Jesus literally rising from the dead, then you're doubting, like doubting Thomas, and you're in the wrong. Actually, this story is also celestial metaphor. It can be shown to be celestial metaphor. For instance, in the text, as you heard, Thomas is called Didymus. Didymus means twin. Nowhere in the canonical scriptures do we learn who Thomas's twin is. But in some of the Gnostic texts, it's actually addressed. Who is the twin of Thomas? And in the Gnostic texts, Jesus himself says that Thomas is his twin and his brother. So Thomas is Jesus' twin. That doesn't work literally because, as we know from the gospel narrative, the nativity scene, we don't hear about two babies being placed in the manger. We only hear about one baby. So was there a twin? This is talking about spiritual matters. This is actually talking about your higher self. The divine twin shows up in many, many scriptures from around the world. There's many scriptures where we have a twin, and one twin is mortal and one twin is divine, or one twin is semi-divine, such as in the Gilgamesh and Enkidu. Gilgamesh is 2/3 divine, or in Castor and Pollux, Polydeuces or Pollux is divine, Castor is mortal. And that's what's going on here as well. With Thomas and Jesus, we can see that Thomas is depicted traditionally throughout history with that same hand gesture that we saw earlier with Ham, indicating Capricorn. And that's because, once again, Aquarius has that forward leg, that very straight forward leg, which in the story of Noah represented Noah being drunk and naked and passed out. In the story of Jesus, it represents the spear wound through the side. And Capricorn is going to place, Jesus is going to say, place your fingers in the wounds in my hand, place your hand in my side. And you can see that the constellation Capricorn in the planetarium images is pointing right towards that forward leg, the spear wound in this case. And throughout history, the Renaissance artists that I'm showing here have indicated that they understand that Thomas is associated with Capricorn. And in fact, the feast day of Thomas is associated with the part of the zodiac constellation that we find with Capricorn. See, the cycle of the year, we get the Earth going through its orbit around the sun, and because of the tilt of our axis, we have our longest day at the summer solstice, or the June solstice in the northern hemisphere. That's when the North Pole is tilted most towards the sun. Days are longer than night, but the opposite end, at the December solstice, the winter solstice in the northern hemisphere, we have the northern hemisphere is tilted away from the sun. That's when the sun has its lowest arc across the sky because of that tilt, and that's when the days are the shortest. And so we have an equinox. As we go around, we have the fall equinox, which is in September in the northern hemisphere as we're heading down towards the December solstice. We have the spring equinox in March as we cross back up to the upper half of the year where days are longer than nights. And so each of those sections we can divide by the zodiac constellations, and giving us a way of breaking down still further than just these 4 great stations on the cycle. We can get more precision. And down here, Capricorn is actually located right after the December solstice in the age of Aries. It gets into the concept of precession, which I'm not going to talk about here. I've talked about it in other videos, but Capricorn represents that constellation down at this lowest point near the December solstice. Sagittarius and Capricorn are right on either side of the December solstice, but that's when we're turning back upwards. This is, in this story of Thomas recognizing his divine twin, Jesus, this is as we plunge down into the lower half of the year. This represents our incarnation in the body, where we forget about our divine nature, where we're thrown down into a horizontal aspect. It's in Egyptian myth where Osiris is laid out in his tomb horizontally. He has gone down to the lower realm. That represents our being encased in a body. But in the Egyptian myths and other myths around the world, the dead Osiris is raised back up, the vertical column. And you see this in the Christ story as well, of course. That's why I call it the so-called New Testament, because these patterns from the Gospels are actually extremely ancient. And Paul even says that he was persecuted for revealing the ancient mystery that is now revealed to you. This is a very ancient concept. It's not just new in the New Testament, but the raising up of the Spirit. That's blessing, not cursing. That's the recognition of the higher self, the recognition of the divine spark in everybody. And that happens in yourself and everybody else, the divine spark that you recognize in yourself and everybody else. And that happens at this turning point when we've gone down to our lowest point, and in the annual cycle, the metaphor is that happens at the winter solstice. That's the point of rebirth for the year. So that's when Capricorn is this doubting figure. Are we actually going to turn back upwards? Is the sun actually going to start rising higher and higher in the sky? Are days actually going to start getting longer and longer? It happens right here at this point. And Capricorn is this doubting figure that has to be reassured. And Jesus says, put your hand here and don't doubt, believe. You actually do have a higher self. That's what it's talking about. You do have a divine twin, which is when you get that intuition, you don't even know where it came from. That's your divine twin talking to you, your higher self talking to you. We see it in lots of different ways in our daily life, but the scriptures the ancient myths are trying to help us to become more in tune with that aspect of our nature so that we can live the way that we're supposed to be living. Not cursing, blessing. But when we see these stories as literal, when you take it as literal, then the story is reduced to, hey, do you believe in this historical terrestrial event that happened some 2,000 years ago? If you do, you're in this category, and if you don't, you're in that category. That's an externalizing, that's a physicalizing of the story. Instead of teaching, it's actually turning on its head the actual teaching of the story. It's inverting. So literalism inverts the actual meaning of the ancient scriptures. And I hope that these two brief examples that can be multiplied many, many hundreds of times from other scriptures in the Bible, but also from other scriptures, from other cultures, from other ancient myths, and other sacred stories from around the world. They are talking in a common system of celestial metaphor. They're talking about spiritual truths. When we take them literally, we not only risk missing their meaning, but we actually invert their meaning.